The history of El Cerrito and this portion of the state of New Mexico is steeped in a long history that is tied to water. This is a semi-arid region, and without available water in this river, very little settlement would have ever occurred here. The water we see here in the Pecos River is water, much of it originates in snowfall up in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The next watershed over at the beginning of this river is the Canadian River, which runs down through Norman, Oklahoma, and the major shed on the other side is the Rio Grande. So the Pecos drains snowpack and precipitation out of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. As it drops off of those mountains into sedimentary deposits, it has carved many valley, windy river valleys. And it's in those valleys that the river itself has provided an opportunity for irrigation. As the water comes down into the village, or into this region, it's captured by a dam. And these dams are a critical element of every single one of these villages. The reason for damming the river is to back it up. If you'll see, the elevation of the river behind the dam, the top of the dam is a number of feet higher than the flow going down the river. So as the water is backed up, it is run through some inlets and then is carried at a higher elevation than the river all the way to the village. In fact, we're only a few feet from river level here, and as we get closer to the village, as the river continues to go down, the irrigation ditch, or a acequia, drops at a much slower rate, and so the water is quite a bit higher than the river. As that water comes in through the village, a large major ditch wraps around the top of all the irrigation fields, all the irrigated farm fields. Then how that is formed, the plants are planted in long rows that go from the river up to the irrigation ditch, and then when it's time to water the field, the ditch is opened up, and by gravity the water runs down the furrows between the plants to irrigate them. And so we're going to see that as it moves through the village, down through the fields, it drains once again back into the Rio Pecos, and then begins its long journey on to the Rio Grande and then the Gulf of Mexico, if it makes it. Today, very little water even follows the Pecos down to the Interstate 10 crossing. When we drove out this time, we saw it was dry as a bone. So this water is pulled out by irrigation, lost to evaporation, and perhaps lost into seep into the ground. The other thing I want to point out before we move on is that as we get into the village, we'll see that the villagers have a well. Until about the early 1950s, they were drinking water out of the ditch, which of course led to a lot of problems like giardia and bacterial contamination. As the water flows in this valley, we have the high, hard rock sides, but we're in a little trench, and this trench is filled with very soft material, and right below it are river rocks. If I could just show you all sorts of pebbles. There's a very thick layer of gravel under here, and so as the water comes down the river, it gets into these valleys and it percolates or infiltrates into this rock layer, and that's going to be the source of the groundwater for the village as well. So we're going to talk about water that comes from a well, and we're going to talk about water that comes from an irrigation ditch. The water from the irrigation ditch is just straight river water siphoned off and sent through town. The water in the well is water that has percolated through the sands and gravels underground, and that has a considerable purifying effect, and then that water can be pumped up and consumed. So the Pecos River is the lifeblood of this community. It's been the lifeblood for indigenous peoples and early Europeans and Americans today. The river it provides water for irrigation in the fields, and also provides water for the people's day-to-day uses. El Cerrito and other villages like this would not survive without the river.